Hello and welcome to Choose FI. Today on the show, we have another fun Roundup episode where Ginger and I talk through just a whole bunch of really interesting topics, just as it relates to those of us on the path to FI. And man, we are set to talk about a lot of things. We're going to talk about some recent trips we just took, taxes in retirement, and how you might actually be paying a lot less than you anticipate, the preferential rate of capital gains, which is really interesting, the rule of 72, Coast-Fi, doing hard things, a book I'm reading called The Gap and the Gain, plus, of course, questions and wins from you, the community, the lifeblood of what we do here at Choose FI. This is going to be a fun one. And with that, welcome to Choose FI. Ginger, it is so good to see you. These are always the highlight of my week. So, this is going to be fun.
Yes, and I know we're both feeling very happy and relaxed because we just got back from trips.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, I know. I talked about a couple trips that I was taking. So, took a big trip to Colorado, and then I actually just did another roller coaster trip with my daughter Anna. So that's been fun. Yeah, that's basically the last 2 weeks now. So I definitely want to go into it. But you are now a cruiser,
I'm a
is what
cruiser.
is what I hear from you.
Yes. Yeah, we just got back from our Alaskan cruise. It was a 7-day adventure, and we went because it was on my husband's bucket list. So
Oh.
I was like very happy to go, but it wasn't like a thing that I was dying to do. But then it turned out I loved it. It was so great. So
Wow.
yeah, it was one of those things I wanted to kind of talk about it a little bit because it's one of those things that we really weren't able to optimize. We just had to like hand over a bunch of cash because points don't work with that kind of thing. But we're like, okay, well, we're going to do it one time. But there were so many advantages. And one question I really had was, okay, our child is 8. Is this really the right time? Is this going to be a good fit for him? And it was so great for the family vacation. And I could really see it being good for extended family. Like if your parents want to come along, it makes that kind of vacation so easy. So, the food was better than I thought it was going to be. I slept great. It was so wonderful to not really have to plan anything. And I didn't realize how big of an advantage that was. We booked one excursion, and that was really enough. Like every other port we went to, it was fun just to walk around and see the national parks. So yeah, I had a great time, and I no longer think that that is my one and only cruise because
Oh,
I
wow.
loved it so much.
That's wild. So, do you think it was the actual? I know you talked about a lot of structural things with the cruise concept in general. Do you think that the actual destination played into it as well? Or do you think you're like a cruiser for life now?
Yeah, I mean, the destination was a big part of it as well because every stop that we made was at some incredibly beautiful, like crazy beautiful naturey thing. And so that definitely played into it because there weren't any of the stops that felt superfluous or not special.
Okay, that makes sense. So, you said the food was better than you expected. What cruise line did you go on?
Royal Caribbean. And the reason we chose that one, I mean, I did kind of do my research and I really wanted to because the three of us were going to be sharing a room. So there had to be enough space, obviously, for the three of us to sleep. And then I wanted to have a balcony, mostly because I was nervous about the three of us like being in this teeny tiny space and I wanted to be able to have a little bit more. So most of those, sort of the mini suites or the place with a pullout and a balcony, are pretty pricey. They were out of my budget.
Yeah.
And so this was one that sort of fell in that. So this was kind of the the cheapest in that, if you have those specifications. And then I also chose this one because it had said it was pretty child friendly. So there was various things that kids could do. And they did. There was a lot of stuff that was really fun for my son.
Nice.
And so it was really fun. Yeah.
That's great. That's really great. And yeah, like you alluded to earlier, it's a little hard to use travel rewards points, or certainly rather difficult to use travel rewards points for cruises. There is only one way that I personally know of that's super accessible, but it's probably not the best way to use these points. So the Capital One Venture Miles,
Hmm.
you've always been able to pay for your cruise with that card. And then as long as it codes as travel,
Uh huh.
which it should certainly, then you can use your Capital One miles to offset part or all of that cruise expense, which is nice. So in this case, you could have paid for Royal Caribbean with your Venture X card, and then could have theoretically wiped out some of the expense. But I guess in this day and age, and I'm still getting used to this because the Capital One Venture miles are now transferable. They're like Chase points or Amex points or Citi Thank You points. There's probably more value, or certainly more value, in the Capital One miles in terms of transferring them to airline partners than just using them as the old, hey, this is going to wipe out some of my expense at like 1 cent per point. So for any cruisers out there, if you're looking to save and that's the kind of travel you take, then yeah, that's a great way to do it. Also, I guess usually you're going to Alaska, you might be flying. Well, you, I guess, are in Washington, but like many of us would be, I guess, traveling out of Seattle or Vancouver, maybe. So you could save on flights to get there. So, I mean, just like anything with travel rewards, there's always ways to save a little bit of money, but sometimes it's just not perfectly optimal. And that's quite all right. Like,
Yeah.
I've talked about trips we've taken to Maine before, and we love Maine. And we go there to Algonquin and stay and pay cash. And I mean, listen, that's perfectly fine. Life does not have to be optimized all the time.
Yeah. As long as we're talking about that, I feel like I should say one thing that wasn't super great or one thing to be aware of. And that was just I wasn't really prepared for how much they were going to try to get you to spend more money on the boat. Like everything is kind of designed that way. So that wasn't really a big deal for me. But as I was thinking about this would be such a good extended family trip, it was something that I noticed because I was like, oh, this would be really annoying and maybe even confusing to my parents. Like some of the things, that you're like, oh, is this included or not? Or things that you assume are included that aren't really. So I could see how someone could spend a lot of money. But then I will say, we also figured something out that like some of the things that are expensive, some of the experiences you can do, like there was a skydiving tunnel thing that you do. Do you know what I'm
Okay.
talking about? Where they
Yeah,
like
yeah,
have
yeah.
the wind come up, right? So it was like $100 a person to do 2 minutes of this thing, right? So it's not something that we were going to do. And there was another thing that was sort of similar where it was like this special $100 view that you could get if you paid extra. But then we found out that you could sign up for these things and do them for free if you did them on a port day. So when most of the people are out,
Oh.
and so we just booked them for like the very end of the time or the very beginning of the time that you're in port. And then we got to do those fun things. So that was a fun thing that I wasn't really expecting that, I didn't think we were going to be able to do, much less for free.
That is awesome. So, right, you kind of like buried the lead there. That's like a really neat hack
Yeah.
that you would never like. That's actually brilliant by the cruise company. Like, that's the epitome of supply and demand, right? Like, to them, they're assuming that essentially everyone is off the boat on a port day, and there are all these activities that are sitting there idle. The employees are quite literally on the boat, right? So, like, there's supply potentially, but the demand is so much lower. If they can charge even a fraction, I mean, that's a win-win for everybody. I love that, Ginger. That's brilliant. And you optimize it the most. It reminds me of when we took our daughters to Disney World a long time ago, like 10 plus years ago. And we waited basically until like the very last day that my younger daughter, Molly, was able to get Disney tickets for free. It's like
Oh,
right at 2 years old. So it's like as her birthday was approaching the next day, like we maximized that last little bit. And in your case, right, like, hey, it's the end of the port day, but it's still by definition as part of this where I can get it for a fraction. That's really, really neat. I like that.
okay. So Colorado,
Yeah.
highs and lows, lessons learned.
Colorado was incredible.
Where were you at again?
So we were in Breckenridge. So yeah, I had planned this with a bunch of Phi really good friends of mine from the Phi community. And it wound up being kind of like a guys retreat, if you will. So a bunch of the people from Longmont, some of the people that happen to be well known in the community, also joined us, and we just had an absolute blast. It was just like this wonderful time of connection. And I had all these like massive plans of like this is going to be an outdoor adventure trip, and we're going to be going and doing constantly. And it was like the antithesis of that. It was, hey, let's slow down. Let's just spend hours talking. Let's go grab a cup of coffee on Main Street in Breckenridge, and it turns into a 2-hour sit down. And we spent a lot of time in the sauna and the hot tub at the Airbnb we were in. And we played pickleball essentially every single day and had a bunch of home cooked meals. A couple of the guys were just like amazing chefs and they made meals for the eight of us. And it was just absolutely awesome, Ginger. Like it was just really lovely. I guess the big outdoor adventure, we did do some stand up paddleboarding and some of the guys did some mountain biking. So, I mean, we got outside, obviously. But the last day we hiked one of the Colorado's 14ers, so 14,000 foot peaks. And this was Quandary Peak. And it's one of the more accessible ones. And I'm not trying to minimize it by any means, because believe me, this is like the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. But for avid hikers, this is clearly one of the starter mountains.
Yeah.
But it was incredibly difficult. And that was a feature, not a bug for me. Like I was just so proud of myself when I finished. And there were so many times where I'm climbing this thing and it's like for Lord of the Rings fans, it reminded me of this like arduous trek to like Mordor. And like, it just seemed like it was never going to end. Like we would have been hiking for hours and I'm still looking at this thing. I'm like, this is going to take 5 more hours. This is
Oh,
impossible.
no.
And it just looked like that. But the funny thing is like your brain just plays games with you the whole time. And so many times I was like, oh, I'm just going to stop. I was kind of ill prepared for this with some bad footwear and I'm coming from sea level. You could hear me like all of these excuses that you could come up with, like, oh, I could barely breathe, yada, yada, yada. But I kept saying to myself, and I was just so proud of myself in the moment where there was literally nothing about this next step that is going to make me stop doing this. There's actually nothing physical or mental that the very next step is going to make me stop. So just take the next step, you know, and stop spinning these tales of, oh, it's so far. Oh, you can barely breathe. Oh, you should have taken more time. Oh, you don't, whatever, blah, 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 blah. Oh. And just take the next step. Because I think, and it wound up, there were three of us who were in this group of, we were all pacing each other. And it got to the point where we were at 13,000 feet plus and we're taking, I don't know, 30, 50, 75 steps and we'd stop for a couple seconds. And if we weren't all spinning this tale of like, oh, people are going to think I'm a wimp or, oh, I shouldn't do this. Oh, I should push through. Like, and you just stop when your body tells you to stop and take a 10-second rest. Like that made all the difference, Ginger. It was astonishing how, like, because we talked to each other and we're like, all right, look, this is where I am right now mentally. And all three of us were. But I think we would have all like wanted to be tough guys in our own head of like, oh, I have to push through. Oh, I have to. And like we were all thinking the same thing. And okay, that very next step is not going to make me stop. So take the next step, right? And if it's 50 steps and you stop for 10 seconds, then great. You take another 50 steps. You're eventually going to get to the top of that mountain. And Ginger, it was so cool. Like it was a crystal clear day. And I think some of the local guys said you could see for like 75 to 100 miles from up there. It was like 14,200 feet. It was just a really wonderful day. It was really, really awesome.
What a good analogy for the Phi journey. But also, the mountain is the mountain, and that's cool you had that experience. Was it a disaster coming down?
Well, okay. So, yeah, this actually gets into the story of my footwear adventure. So, I only owned one pair of shoes, Ginger, which is crazy. And they're these Zero brand, so XERO. I've been wearing these things for like every day for the last 4 or 5 years. They're kind of like barefootish
Okay.
shoes. They're like the zero drop shoes. And
Yeah.
I wear them to everything. I wear them outside of sports. I wear them just in life. I wear them to the gym. And I didn't think about it. Like I didn't think, hey, dummy, you shouldn't climb a mountain in zero drop shoes. And basically, for 24,000 steps, I more or less had rocks jabbing into my feet the entire time to the point where, and again, these are well constructed shoes, so no negative on zero. This is my own fault. It literally impaled the shoe at one point. It just went straight through the sole. I had a massive rock like in my shoe. So, yeah, needless to say, the people who had the proper footwear were able to kind of like run down and it was a fun thing. And I had to like take every step very, very, very carefully. So, yeah, that's the very long answer to your question, but it was a little harder than it should have been. But I rectified that. I went out and bought actual nice shoes because this hopefully is the first of many for me of doing things like this. I really, really thoroughly enjoyed it.
Did you read Born to Run at some point?
I did years ago.
Yeah,
Yes.
me too. I bring that up because he's the big advocate, or was my introduction to the idea of like the barefoot running.
Yes.
And he had a really compelling argument. So yeah, I was definitely into that for a while.
Nice. Yeah, and these are not for anybody, making fun of me silently in their head. These are not like the Vibram 5 fingers or whatever they're called, like with the individual toes, and you kind of look a little bit odd. No, no offense meant to anybody, anybody who wears them, but these are just regular shoes. They're just like very, very thin. So, needless to say, not something you should wear climbing a very, very large mountain. But speaking of large mountains, we always want to bring in listener feedback and emails and such. So this is a response that I got from Henry to my newsletter, I guess, that I published, I think, in the beginning of September. So he said, apologies for the long email, but the topic of doing hard things came up and it synced with my own experience on a similar activity. So he said in a prior trip, they'd used travel rewards points to take a trip to Japan, which included climbing Mount Fuji with my 10-year-old son. We just finished up our trip, and your words reflect my experience exactly during our 2-day Fuji climb. Throughout the climb, I had experienced both the challenge of motivation. My son started waning at the end of the first day, and ramen was the driving force to getting to our mountain hut for the night, as well as my own mental willpower on the descent, operating on only a couple hours of sleep. And he said, this quote in particular was our experience exactly. And this was from me. Quote, we got to the point where we'd walk a few dozen steps and stop for a rest. Was it optimal? No, but we made it. And then Henry goes on to say, there were many times where I admittedly got myself mentally defeated. I gave up. However, even during those difficult times, I was glad there was no easy way out. And the only way would be to do this and finish the hard thing as essentially a fundamental man versus nature. We would either physically get ourselves down the mountain or die on it. There was no technology vehicle that could bail us out, and we made it, albeit the descent took 7 hours, double the estimated time, mostly because of how many breaks we took. And he actually said, I'm attaching some of the pictures. I wore my Choose FI t-shirt on the adventure, which was very, very cool. But yeah, it's interesting, Ginger. I mean, this is quite literal, the mountain in both of our cases. But like you said, there's an interesting tie to FI and any long journey that is literally just thousands of individual steps, right?
And how important it is for us in order to have a meaningful life to take on some of these harder challenges when it is so easy not to.
Yes, 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 yes. And there's a brilliant book by a man named Michael Easter called The Comfort Crisis. And he actually talks about a Japanese concept called the misogi. And yeah, it's similar to essentially taking these just extraordinarily difficult tasks or, I don't know, challenges, let's say. And there are a couple rules of these misogis where it shouldn't be so easy that you're 100% sure you're going to be able to do it. I think in it, he talks about like a 50% potential success rate. And obviously, like not dying is part of part of the rules of these things. Not telling anybody about it after the fact, is if you're doing like one of these true misogis. But it's interesting. I think there are a lot of people who have read that book, The Comfort Crisis. I know who have spoken to me about it and just talked about how influential it's been. So for anybody listening, that's a really good one. I think that opened my eyes to just this concept of doing something difficult and how really essential it is to our souls, right, Ginger? I mean, we live in hermetically sealed, air conditioned boxes that are 70 degrees, 365 days a year. And I don't think humans were meant to live that way necessarily, though I'm not complaining about having the option, but you have to go out of your way to challenge yourself.
Yeah. It makes me think of what I think of as one of my mental wins on this trip. I think I do sauna and cold plunge. And when we were in Juneau, we kind of went on this little hike, and there was a gal who was going to jump in the water. And this is Alaska, like this is freezing cold water. And you could tell she really wanted to do it, but she was really hesitating and really scared. And I thought, okay, I could do this no problem, and I didn't, because I didn't feel like getting in my underwear in front of all those people. But realizing that I had done that thing enough times, which like, it's not to say that the water wouldn't be cold and it wouldn't be uncomfortable, but I had lessened the resistance to that specific thing. And I knew that I would not have to do that process that she was doing.
Gotcha.
And I hope that that translates to other areas of my life. It's not just, oh, I can get in really cold water. I think that it does, But there is some sort of training there that if you do these things that are really uncomfortable over and over and over again, it builds up your tolerance for those things.
Yeah, I totally agree. I
Yeah.
think that's the perfect way to put it. And yeah, I mean, I think doing difficult things, that's something that a lot of us in the fight community know intimately about, right? I mean, we're doing something just by its very nature. We're not living the FOMO lifestyle, right? The YOLO, whatever you want to call it. We understand like you have to think long term. That to me is one of the essential hallmarks of our community, where we're thinking in terms of decades, not in terms of the pleasure of the next 5 seconds. And I think that long termism is what sets most of us up for success. There's very little that's akin to like a diet, financial or otherwise, right? And it's like, all right, you need to set your life up as a system that works. And yeah, part of it really is doing difficult things. It's difficult to save money. Let's not lie to ourselves. Like, I think sometimes, Ginger, I know I can be guilty of this, is like maybe making this sound easier than it is. But for many people who have a 0% savings rate and are just living this standard American life, to make changes, it takes some willpower, it takes some guts, it takes some long term thinking, it takes some real thought. And I think we should all look at where we've been and look where we are today and congratulate ourselves on that. Yeah, and this actually has been really on my mind lately. It's a book I'm reading called The Gap and the Gain, and it's by Dan Sullivan and Dr. Benjamin Hardy. And it's so beautiful in its simplicity, but Ginger, it's like changed my entire mindset on life, honestly. And
Is this a personal finance book?
no, it's not a personal finance book. I guess the subtitle here is The High Achiever's Guide to Happiness, Confidence, and Success. And it's more just like positive psychology and just looking at life a little bit differently. So the concept is the gap is the negative way that most of us look at most situations in life. It's the gap between where we are and essentially perfection.
Mm.
Which, let's be frank, most of us are not getting to perfection anytime soon, right? Versus if you reorient and look at the gain, which is look at where you started from and the positive, the gain to where you are today. And that reorientation can just make a massive difference because I think so many of us focus on the negative all the time. And I recently spoke with my personal trainer, Dean Turner, about this, where I've been guilty of it and I didn't have the language for it until I read this book. And I think that's what I love so much about reading and learning is like sometimes having even like a very simple concept like this. Like I'm sure everyone listening to me is saying like, oh, that doesn't sound that revolutionary, but I promise you it is revolutionary, or at least it is to me. It's like I have been looking at my fitness, unfortunately, in this negative gap perspective of, hey, I'm trying to get down to a certain weight goal. And it's proven rather difficult these last X pounds. And like, I don't get too fanatical about this. So please, nobody worry about me or think I'm gone crazy. But like, I have a goal and it's proven very difficult to get there. So every time I think about my fitness now, it's a negative because I'm just looking at this gap between where I am and perfection, basically. And that's literally essentially what we're talking about is perfection versus looking at the gain of, oh my God, Brad, like last January to today is an astonishing gain, like utterly transformatively astonishing. And when you look at that, you have positive momentum to do more. So, like, the real funny upshot of this, Ginger, is I suspect by focusing on the gain and being positive, I'm actually going to get to that crazy goal
Yeah.
much more rapidly than if I was just focusing on, oh man, it's so hard. I can't believe it. Like, why can't I do this? Blah, blah, all that gap thinking. So, yeah, this is a book that I've read. Yeah, I'm still in the process of it. And a huge shout out to Veronica, who we met at the extraordinary event in Las Vegas, who gave me this recommendation. And it's just been a really, really good one.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense that that is the thing that would help you move forward because, of course, like you're going to be a lot more motivated. Like it speaks to self efficacy. If you can see, oh, I can do things, oh, I have done things, that propels you in a way that, of course, this language of, geez, I keep failing. It's hard to get moving from there.
Yeah. I think if we're all honest with ourselves, we spend a lot of time thinking this is a very stark example, obviously. And I use that very specifically because it is so stark and so like defined. But I think a lot of us are in that gap between here and perfection,
Mm.
as opposed to just like, again, going back to our FI journey. And are you at FI right now? For all the people listening to this, what percentage of them are at FI? It's probably a very, very small. But does that mean you should only focus on the negative between here and that exact FI number? Like, no. Think about all those dozens or hundreds of positive changes you've made in your life that have compounded to get you to the point where you are today. Because frankly, all of your neighbors and friends who have essentially made none of these changes, most likely, are still in the same spot they were X number of years ago. And they're still going to be in the same spot Y number of years in the future. Whereas you are essentially guaranteed on this path to FI. And that's what's so cool about FI is it's this little win after little win, and they just compound into something spectacular.
Okay, I love that. I think this is a nice bridge to a more logistical question about early retirement. So I was really interested in you were talking to Rachel a couple weeks back, and she said something that sounded so hopeful to me, where she said people really overestimate the amount of taxes that they're going to be paying in retirement, right? And she was talking about how the stakes are so high here because that means that you're actually working longer than you really need to be working. So I'm getting all excited. Yes, I'm in this like group of normal people who does the things that normal people do. I am also overestimating because I was doing exactly what she said, where she said they think about, okay, here's going to be my income and here's kind of my tax bracket, the end, right? That's what I do. So then I started thinking about, okay, well, why would it be so much less? And I feel like I am missing something. So I wanted you
Okay.
to fill in the gap. So here's all I've come up with. Okay, I know that there is something about you might be in a lower tax bracket because you might be spending less. And even some of the stuff around like Vicki Robinson's thing about how you're actually paying to work. I can really get behind understanding that my expenses are going to be less in retirement for a couple of really good reasons. So, okay, maybe that tax bracket will be lower or slightly lower. Okay. I also get that long term capital gains, if we're talking about like a brokerage account, the taxes on those are way better than I understood even a year ago. That in fact, you can pull quite a bit as a married couple before you're going to get taxed on those gains. So I get that depending how big that bucket is, that is something to think about. And then, of course, I also get that depending on how much you have in a Roth account, that can also be a factor. So I have some other questions, but when I think about those things, like those are all real,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't see that information as leading to like, gosh, I'm really overestimating what my taxes are going to be. Do you think I'm missing something here?
Yeah, it's a good question. So you just ticked off at least three major things that I was all just nodding along with, and those are some of the main items. But at its essence, I think it's more like a holistic thing where we're all well. First off, let's even take another step back and say I think most people think and believe that they pay a significantly more in federal tax than they actually do.
Hmm.
I think most people are frankly kidding themselves when they think they're taxed to high heavens and blah, 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 blah. Like, I think that's just objectively false. It's an emotion that is rooted in a lot of things and it's not generally rooted in reality, especially for people making, I don't know, under $150,000 as a, let's say, married couple. Just objectively, if you actually look at your numbers, they're shockingly small for what you suspect. And I'm just talking in generalities here, but I think just like anything in FI, it's actually understanding what am I actually paying today, right? So to have a starting point, which I think is essential.
And I'll
Yeah,
just jump
please.
in here and say, to clarify for people who are listening, I think what you're talking about is your effective tax rate versus what you're seeing as the marginal tax rate.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. Oh, you rock. That's exactly. So, yeah, the marginal tax rate is basically in our graduated income tax system for federal taxes. The marginal bracket is like, as we say in accounting, it's like marginal is the next dollar or the last dollar, as however you want to look at it. So we talk about tax brackets and people say like, oh, I'm in the 24% tax bracket, right? But I think most people immediately say, oh, that means every dollar of my income gets taxed at 24%, as if once you get $1 over the 22% rate, then every prior dollar gets taxed at 24%. It does not work that way. There are tax brackets that you work your way through as you get more and more income. So, for instance, let's say married filing joint for 2024, and this is on taxable income. So this is after all of your deductions, of which the standard deduction is a massive one that's almost right around $30,000 actually. And that's where we're going to eventually land here, Ginger. But the first $23,200 of taxable income is taxed at 10%. So even like I said, with that standard deduction of about, let's just say for ease that it's 30,000. So you would add 23,200 and add 30,000 to that, right? So you're talking, you could have gross income of $53,200 in that case, and you would only pay $2,320 of federal tax on that. Because again, you get that standard deduction, and then it's only 10% tax on that first 23,200. So in that case, your effective tax rate, which is basically the tax liability divided by your gross income. So again, we said it's $2,320 of tax divided by about $53,200 of gross income. That's a 4.36% effective tax rate. So you're paying 4.36% tax on $53,000 worth of income. And I will just quickly, since I went into that about the tax bracket. So for married filing joint, the next income, so from $23,201 all the way up to $94,300, the tax rate is only 12% on that. 12%. So, I mean, anybody who thinks that in FI that they're going to be paying some crazy, crazy tax rate, it just, the numbers don't prove that out, because realistically, if we're saying it's roughly a $30,000 standard deduction, and just to be clear, that's not the exact number, but just for ease of that, you could have $124,000 plus of gross income, and you're still in the 12% tax bracket. So you're talking a little bit more than $11,000. It's still under a 10% effective tax rate on income up to $124,000. I mean, Ginger, that's incredible, So where this lands for your question, I think like you have all the tactics right. And I love that. And I think all the tactics are really important. But the holistic picture is, hey, look, I'm at FI. My expenses are going to be some reasonable number, right? Because the other part that people miss is to get your actual, I think most people think they spend way more than they actually do. Let's even say you make a lot of money. Like as a married couple, you make $200,000. So in this case, you're talking about, all right, your starting point is the highest income essentially you've ever earned. So in this case, let's say $200,000. So I guess after deductions, you'd be in the 22% bracket. You'd pay 22% on that last little more than $106,000 of income. So what ultimately you need to think about is you are paying your highest both marginal tax bracket at that point and effective tax rate. Plus, because it's earned income, you're paying Social Security tax on that as well. So there's an actual reasonable case to be made for somebody making 200,000 that they're paying probably 20 to 25%, somewhere around that. Well, actually, with Social Security, it could be closer to 30%, but let's say 20 to 30% in total federal taxes. And you have to take that out of there. Like when you think about, hey, my income is my taxes at the highest amount, and then all the savings, right? Like think about it in terms of three different pieces of a pie. So 200,000 is split amongst savings, which have to be significant to reach FI in any reasonable period of time. If it's 40%, it's going to take you 17 or 18 years to reach FI. So our table stakes for this conversation is you have a lot of savings. That's obviously not spending. You have this tax liability that is spending now, but won't be in the future. So when you get down to it, I suspect for most people, their expenses are actually a lot lower than what they think. And where this lands, Ginger, is when you're at FI, you just have to cover those expenses. And like we proved, there's a reasonable case that your effective tax rate is going to be minimal. You're not going to be paying Social Security tax on money that you pull out of your brokerage account or your IRAs or 401ks. So that portion is gone. So your tax goes down even further. So you're literally just covering, like, hey, what does my life cost?
Mm-hmm.
And for most people, even somebody, like I said, making 200,000, like once it gets down to it and you've taken out that tax expense, you've taken out that massive savings, like there's just not that much money left for expenses. Even if we said 80 or 100,000, right? It's like, okay, then you just have to cover $80,000, let's say. So even if worst case scenario, you took all 80,000 of that out of your 401k, that's all a taxable event. So your gross income on your tax return is 80,000. Well, you still get that $30,000 standard deduction. So that takes your taxable income down to 50,000. And like we proved out before, about half of that is going to be in the 10% bracket, half of that's going to be in the 12% bracket. So you're talking about paying somewhere in the vicinity of $5,000 in federal tax on $80,000. So in this case, that's a pretty fat FI for a lot of people because, again, this was predicated on making like a $200,000 income to have somewhere in the vicinity of $80,000 to $100,000 in expenses. So that person, even in the worst case scenario, is probably paying about $5,000 in federal taxes on 80,000.
Yeah.
So you're talking, what's that, about 6% or thereabouts of effective tax rate?
This is making me feel great. Can you talk me through, is there a scenario in which you wouldn't be pulling from your Roth last? And I guess what I'm thinking, and mostly this is just sort of interesting, I think, to think about, right? But I get that you have your standard deduction. And then what you could do is you could pull from your 401k, assuming you're of that age, up to, say, the 10%, right? And then after that, you could say, oh, it would make the most sense then for me to pull from my Roth because I don't want to get taxed more than 10%. Or you could play with those in any way, right? One thing that I hear in the FI community all the time is like, oh, you get to choose sort of how you're taxed. And so be thinking about how much you would pull from here and how much you would pull from there. But the way I'm thinking about it is there's no scenario in which you wouldn't be better off having your Roth grow
Okay.
as long as possible. And so it seems to me like even if you were going to pull more than the 90 whatever thousand, that it would still make the most sense to completely deplete your 401k before you ever move to Roth. Is that how you think about it, or is that just really unsophisticated?
No, well, I don't think it's unsophisticated. I think there are multiple factors that come in where you would want flexibility. I've talked about this on past episodes with Sean Mullaney and Cody Garrett. So I know with Sean, it was episode 475. We talked about how to access your retirement accounts before 59 and a half. And yeah, I don't have the exact episode links for, because we've talked about this in passing in a couple episodes recently, but there's some interplay between having enough income for really the ACA. So, health insurance is a massive thing for people in early retirement. And because we have the ACA exchanges now, and more importantly for us, is the subsidies. You don't want to have your income too low. There's like this needle to thread, right? Like you don't want it too low because I think then in some states you're on Medicaid, I want to say. I always get a little bit confused with state by state and the exact terminology, but like your income, you need to massage it basically to be high enough to be over some threshold, but then under the ACA subsidy, an amount where you get a significant amount of subsidies. So some people will massage this to kind of fit right into that sweet spot. And then, that brings up another question that a lot of people ask, like, oh, how do I get health insurance in early retirement? It's like, I feel like some people miss the memo that like we've had, this, what the horrible term Obamacare, but we've had the ACA for, I think it's like 10 years now. And like, this is the way to get personal health insurance when you're not going through a company. Like this should be seared into our heads now. Like this exists, it's real. And I've never seen, and we've searched for health insurance for years now through, I guess, Choose a Vibe because it technically is a company, right? For me and Jonathan, and then also the ACA. Like The ACA is very competitive, even without the subsidies. So it's essentially the same as I've seen in the private market, if you will. And then, yeah, for early retirees who their income is low, they can get these subsidies and then pay virtually zero
Mhm.
for their health insurance. So, yeah, I mean, that's like just another kind of ancillary benefit, but not insignificant one.
Yeah. So you are clarifying something for me. And just to be clear, when you're saying income, you mean taxable income, right?
Yes, 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 yes.
That's what those numbers are based on.
Right. What a brilliant point. And thank you. I'm so glad you clarified that because I think a lot of us think income is the amount of expenses that I need to cover each year at FI. But yeah, I'm talking the very technical taxable income. And I
Mhm.
think that's what's kind of fun about having a lot of these different levers to pull. Like having Roth enables you to pull that out then tax free at that point, right? Because you've already paid the tax when the money went in. That's the whole concept behind Roth accounts. Like you talked about in your lead up to this, was you were talking about the long term capital gains tax. And this is something I'm going to go into on an advanced FI episode very soon with Cody Garrett. So stay tuned for that. We're going to talk very specifically on how you can pay $0 in long term capital gains tax on, I think in 2024, it's on up to $94,050 of total taxable income, which is really, really interesting. That's outside the scope, Ginger, of what we're doing here. But I think it's important just so people understand, like you have your money in your retirement accounts, right? Your 401k, your traditional IRAs, your Roth IRA. But a lot of us have money in just regular brokerage accounts after tax, having nothing to do with any special retirement account. These are just it's just our savings account that happens to be at a brokerage and we're invested in mutual funds or ETFs or individual stocks. Well, let's say you bought, I don't know, VTI over the years for $50,000. You bought shares that have basis, your actual purchase of $50,000, but it's worth $100,000 today. Okay. Now, when you sell that and you get what's known as proceeds, so you got proceeds of $100,000, that's what's deposited into your bank account. But that $100,000 is not taxable as income. It's what's the capital gain on that? Okay. So in that case, and I'm making this very simplistic, not including dividends reinvested. So for any sticklers out there, but in very simplistic terms, it's just what were my sale proceeds, the 100,000, minus what's my basis, the 50,000, and that gets your capital gain. So that's a $50,000 capital gain in this case. And if you've held them for more than 1 year, then it's a long term capital gain. And that's actually taxed at a preferential rate. Okay. So for most people who are not very high income, it's either 15% long term cap gains rate, which is fantastic. Even if you're in the, like we talked about before, the 24% bracket or 22%, because capital gains, the government has basically said, for whatever reason, we want to make this a preferential item, you get a benefit. So I think most people hear like, oh, capital gains. Like I know my parents were guilty of this, like growing up, like because it has a terminology, Ginger, I feel like people somehow think it's like a negative thing. And I just want to like shake them and just say, like, no, this is a good thing. The government is showering benefits on us. Like they're giving it to this long-term capital gains tax rate at 15% or 0%. And that's what I talked about in passing there of like, if your taxable income, including those capital gains, is under $94,050, you pay a big fat $0 in tax. So in this case, like I said, you got proceeds of $100,000. So $100,000 was deposited into your bank account. But if that was the only taxable event you had that year, let's say you had no income, you took no money out of your 401k, your long term capital gain in this case would be $50,000. Because again, proceeds minus basis. And then that goes on your tax return. But because the government has said not only are long term capital gains preferential normally at 15%, we're just going to give it to you for free. So this is 0%. So in that case, you got $100,000 deposited into your bank account and you pay $0 in tax on it. So that's yet another reason why I suspect your effective tax rate is going to be a lot lower than you expect it to be.
That is magic. I will say one thing I think that this can help with is to not hesitate about opening a brokerage account because I do think, we don't actually max out our retirement accounts. And so to open a brokerage account, I did hesitate because I thought, oh, well, from what I understood at the time, I'm like, oh, why would I do this thing that has, I'm going to have to pay so much higher taxes on? And understanding that helps you to go, okay, I ultimately made that decision because I wanted more flexibility. I wanted to, retire early. But now I understand that not only does it give me that flexibility, but it's not this big tax hit that I assumed that I was going to take, right, for making this decision.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So that was a bit of a longer explanation than I anticipated, but I think that's going to be really helpful for people because the essence of your question gets back to like my age old complaint about like retirement calculators, where I think they start from the fundamentally wrong position of like, hey, what's your current income?
Hmm.
But again, like in your current income, and I'm not sure I was 100% clear on this before, like in your current income is by definition to reach any point where you could retire, FI or whatever you want to call it, there has to be a massive savings in there. And there's by definition a significantly higher tax amount than will ever be later when you reach FI. So starting at your current income makes no sense. It's your
Yeah.
current expenses. And I think that's why the massive number that we care about when we talk about any FI calculation is what does my life cost? What do I have to cover with whatever amount of income or passive income or side hustles or taking money out of brokerage or taking money out of 401ks, et cetera? Like the only thing that matters is what does my life cost? That's the starting point.
I love these questions about sort of the basics of how some of this stuff works because most of us aren't CPAs. And so it's really helpful to kind of go step by step at like, okay, here's how this works. So let's transition now to looking at a real life example, maybe. And maybe this doesn't get into the taxes, but sort of ultimately what so many of us are doing as we're listening is saying, okay, well, how is this going to play out in my life? So let's see how this is playing out in someone's life. Okay. So this is an email we got from Patty, and I'm going to read part of it here. She says, "Hi, I'm 60 years old and have just discovered FI. I love your podcast. I'm hoping you can point me to some episodes that are better for me who only has another 10 years to make a big impact. I make about 100K and I'm proud to say I already have low expenses and have sent my son to college with his college funds. I only have half of my fire goal saved, and so I'm willing to play with at least half of my income." So she's sort of looking for some guidance at this stage, right? So Brad, what do you think about where she's at and what she needs to be thinking about how to meet her goal in 10 years?
Yeah, this was a really fascinating one from Patty because yeah, she had a lot of like very technical questions and at the end of her email she basically said, "I'm so excited to start the process. Any tips you can give would be great. It would save me some research time since I don't have much time left."
Mhm.
And I actually wrote back to her saying, "Patty, you are rocking this. You're so far ahead of where you think you are. And it's essentially a guarantee." And this kind of ties into a couple of things, Ginger. So it's the concept of coast-fi. It's also understanding compounding. And let's say like the rule of 72, which is something that sounds complicated, but isn't. And yeah, I mean, just essentially like how quickly your money will double. So, yeah, let's start from there. So, first off, 10 years is an extraordinary amount of time, right? Especially when you're talking a 50% savings rate. And I think when we've talked before, a little take off of Mr. Money Mustache's the shockingly simple math behind early retirement, which I think is one of the absolute most important articles basically ever written, certainly in the personal finance world. It should take you about 15 years to get to FI, basically starting at $0 of money saved up if you have a 50% savings rate. So Patty is saying that she has roughly a 50% savings rate and she has 10 years. So even if she was starting from zero, she would be well on her way. But she's actually saying, I have half of my FI goals saved up. So to me, that suggests, okay, I spend roughly $50,000 a year and I have to figure out my FI number, right? So you roughly multiply by 25 and that comes out to 1.25 million. So 1,250,000 and she has half of that. So we're going to assume that in her investable net worth, all of her investment accounts, she has about $625,000 saved up. Okay. So, Ginger, the way that CoastFi works is basically when you've reached a point where you can just kind of coast on in, you don't actually have to save any more money. But if your investable net worth can do its thing, its compounding thing in the background, while you're just coasting along essentially at a 0% savings rate, and it can, like I said, do its thing or double really every roughly 9 years. Okay. And this is where that rule of 72 comes in, which you don't really need to like understand this. It's just a simple mathematical equation. It's you take the number 72 and you divide by your expected annual return. Okay. So we say it's roughly 8%. So obviously nobody can guarantee anything, but that's the rough number we go with. So you take 72, you divide by 8, and that comes out to a nice even 9, which is the number of years it will take your money to double. Okay. So Patty, if she's starting from $625,000 today, 9 years from today, she will have 1.25 million and she will be at FI. Okay. So she literally, just by definition, the money doubles in 9 years, assuming obviously that 8% annual return. And that's on average, of course. Nobody can guarantee specific numbers every year. But I mean, Ginger, she's there. So like she's worried, do I have enough time? I'm saving 50% of my income. Can I do this? Am I running out of time? You could save $0, Patty, and you'd be at FI in 9 years, not even 10. Okay. And I just did like a simple compound interest calculator. I basically said, like, all right, we have 625,000. We're putting in $4,000 a month because she said she saves roughly 50% of her $100,000 income. So that would be about $48,000 a year. Then I assumed the 8% annual return. And then I just played with the number of years of growth to get us to roughly that 1.25 million. And Ginger, she actually gets there in 5 years.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, Patty was certainly worried about reaching it in 10 years. I think saving that amount of money, starting with the amount of money she's starting with, she gets to FI in roughly 5 years. So yeah, she can either coast on in 9, or she could basically stop working in 5 and be there. So I think that's kind of an illustration of just like, okay, money compounds. That's what we always talk about. Like you get to the point where your money is growing more than any income you've ever brought in. And it seems hard to believe at the beginning of your FI journey, but like all of us have had this epiphany of like, oh my God, I can't believe how much my net worth went up in the last year, right? Where the stock market's been up, whatever, 20 odd percent. When you're starting on a significant net worth, you can't fathom how much it has gone up. It's crazy. And like, that's what's one of the coolest parts of compounding and investing in the market is like, it really can be extraordinary. So yeah, I mean, again, Patty had a lot of technical and like very specific questions, but like I think they're all unnecessary. I think she can get there really easily.
Yeah. Now, since we were just talking about taxes, taxes are at the top of my brain here. And I'm thinking, well, is this something we need to be figuring in even in our basic calculations? She has $50,000 that she can play with, but that $50,000 is going to be taxed, or are we assuming she's going to put it in a tax advantaged account, or is this something that's like because of our previous conversation where it's like, okay, maybe we don't need to be thinking about this so much?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the latter point is probably certainly true. But I think so. We're talking about during her earning years now, right? So I have to assume that if she's saying I make $100,000 a year and I'm able to save, like I took her at face value basically and said, like, I'm able to save about 50,000. So I'm assuming that amongst the 50,000 remaining, right, which is spending, that's all her life spending plus her taxes. Because I think by definition, if she's able to save 50, there's only 50 left for everything else, which is the tax expense and all her life expenses. So, we could get more granular, obviously, if she wanted to send us line by line. But yeah, I mean, assuming that's the case, I think what a lot of people, and I think really your question is brilliant in that I think a lot of people don't factor in taxes at all when they're doing these calculations, and savings rates sometimes like it's just easy to overlook. And frankly, like that, it might actually just wash out in a weird way in the sense that like most people think of their income as their after tax income, after all their withholding and stuff. And then, yeah, that actually works because, all right, here's the income that I take home. Here's what I can save. Because at the end of the day, it's like, all right, what are my true expenses? What is my true savings? Those numbers are fine. And like we talked about over this whole episode, your tax expense very likely is going to be dramatically lower than you expected in FI. So you don't want to count it as zero, obviously, Ginger, because it's not going to be zero for most people. But you also don't want to have an unrealistically high tax line item in your FI budget. But you clearly need one. I think anybody who's sticking their head in the sand and saying, like, I'm just not going to pay any taxes, like the likelihood of that for most people is pretty slim.
Okay, it's time for us to transition to that part of the show that I really like, where we talk about community wins. So I wanted to read this email from David. He says, I would like to thank you for the impact you've had on my personal situation. Since finding FI around 5 years ago via Choose FI and putting the principles to work, I have increased my total invested assets sevenfold and started to enjoy the real powers of compounding and now consider myself 50% FI. Woohoo! After episodes on FU Money and from reading The Simple Path to Wealth, after finding it via Choose FI, I understood the concept, but truly got to understand it these last 12 months. Around a year after suffering some mental health issues related to stress, I was let go from a 6-figure salary job, and from a role in my younger days was always my ambition to reach. In the past, this would have been a devastating event. However, having found FI, it happened when I already had around 3 years of expenses accessible in a Vanguard account and a clear vision of where I want to go in my FI plan, rather than linking my identity solely to my role or title. It gave me the space to refocus on what was important to me. I took some time to set up a side hustle on eBay, building that up before taking a new job, on half the money and a third of the stress. It also gave me time to focus on my investments, and as a result, remarkably, in my timeline to FI is now looking faster than it was a year ago. Thanks again for all you do.
Oh, that's a great one. That's really great.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many wins in that one paragraph. Some of them are financial, but the bigger one is just about, hey, I had a chance to think about what I wanted from my life. And, that's sort of the power of learning some of these things, I think.
Yeah, that's a really great one. I want to read just a couple quick ones. So Kevin wrote in with something very tactical. And he said, from the advice on Choose of I shopped around my homeowner's insurance for the first time in my life. I got more coverage for $1,100 per year less.
What?
This was a great investment for a little time. Ginger, that's crazy, right?
That's awesome.
And we got this one from DeSell, who wrote in and said, I just wanted to share that other than through your newsletter, I didn't even know the stock market was down for a bit. For better or for worse, I don't follow the news and I'm also not on social media, though even if I did, I don't think I would have changed anything. And what's funny is in my newsletter, I wasn't talking about how bad it was. It was quite the opposite. It was just, this is but a blip.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what's so cool about our long-term mentality is you don't have to worry about it. So many people are stressing about that day-to-day, what's going to happen. And this was like maybe a month ago where it looked like the market dropped a couple of percent. And then within 3 or 4 trading days, it literally was back up where it was. And had you fallen asleep for those 5 days, or in this case, just literally not looked at the news or social media, you would have had zero idea. And you would have been perfectly content versus Ginger. Think about all the people who stressed every second of those days that the market was going down. And this is a marathon. This is not some bizarro little sprint where we're worried about every trading day. You're worried about 30 to 50 plus years.
Yeah. I love it because it doesn't seem like a traditional win. But when you think about it, it's like the J.L. Collins whole thing is like, if you understand this a little bit, then you can calm down.
Yeah, you can calm down. And J.L. Collins says that guided meditation for when the stock market's dropping,
Yeah.
which I always love linking up. So yeah, that's a good one for people to Google. And yeah, just finally, we always like to talk about travel rewards wins. And Nick wrote in with this, we did it. My partner and I just booked round trip airfare to Italy for 2 weeks around Thanksgiving for free with our rewards points. And we're flying out of our local airport, Richmond. So no need to trek to DC or Charlotte. Plus, since we planned it around the holiday when we both have paid time off, our 14-day adventure only uses up 7 vacation days. The flights would have cost us $2,200 plus each. But thanks to the insights from Choose Advice Travel Rewards podcast and blog, we scored international flights for $0. Basically, just a little bit of taxes and fees is my editorial here. Next up, we're diving into using points for hotel stays. Thanks a million for sharing your expertise. And yeah, I mean, Nick, that is fantastic. A 14-day trip around Thanksgiving, no less. I
Yeah.
mean, when a lot of people are traveling, Ginger, but yet they were able to use their points. That's super cool. All right, Ginger. Well, this has been awesome as always. I love ending it with these wins, and yeah, we never know where these roundup type episodes are going to take us, and that's what's fun about it. So yeah, thanks for being here as always.
See you next time.
Sounds good.